So hello and welcome to this PDW with the title Strategizing as Communicative Practice, Connecting the SAP with the CCO Community. And this PDW is recorded for the virtual AOM 2020. And the PDW is sponsored by the Strategizing Activities and Practices Interest Group, the SAP Interest Group. So before we start, we will briefly introduce ourselves, our panelists, and also the agenda for the next hour. So thanks, Max. My name is Milena Leibold, and I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Innsbruck. And in my research, I usually apply a communication perspective on organizational phenomena, in particular on phenomena of organizational openness, including topics like inclusion, visibility, accessibility, and participation. And last year, I've started to investigate a case of a strategic transformation process towards becoming more open that I wanted to approach with a CCO lens. And this project led me to the field of SAP research and was also my motivation to organize this PDW today, since I've realized that there might be some interesting overlaps to talk about. And what about you, Max?
Yeah, welcome from my side as well. My name is Maximilian Heimstedt. I'm a postdoc at Weizenbaum Institute in Berlin, Germany. Weizenbaum Institute is an interdisciplinary research center that studies the nexus of the internet and society at large. And I would say that in contrast to Milena, my starting point is the SAP community. So I would say rooted in the strategy as practice research tradition, but in there I'm also I became interested in more transparent or open forms of organizing, which kind of over time led me more and more into the realm of communication studies as well, and that's where I discovered the CCO perspective. And as Milena already foreshadowed, these two stories, so coming from CCO and moving towards SAP and the other way around, was the starting point for this PDW. So our idea was that we have these two research communities which are not super young, but also not extremely established, so kind of teenage research communities, maybe 10 or 15 years old, which kind of feel a little bit similar, but then also different at other points. And we wanted to pin these similarities and differences down or carve them out a little bit more by bringing together us who have worked in both positions or at the intersection of SAP and CCO research. And we hope by doing so that we can, on the one hand, identify many points for collaboration, but also aspects where the two perspectives disagree and maybe can pick a good battle or a general controversy between the two perspectives.
Right, and now I'm very happy to welcome our panelists for today's workshop. So we have Virpi Sosa and Nada Enrisat, who is on holiday today, Jimmy Holstein, Tim Kuhn, and Nicolas Boschecki, who all have somehow worked on the intersection of strategy and communication. And in the following around 40 minutes, they will present parts of their work. And each panelist has 8 minutes to do this. And we will introduce them to you right before the talks. And afterwards, we have some time to discuss what has been said. So to talk about that, to react on it, and also to discuss a few topics emerging in these fields of research. So now it's time for the panel. So Jeannie would be the first panelist, and I would kindly ask you to come into the screen and share your screen, please.
Oh, wrong one, hang on. There we are.
briefly wait until Jeannie is setting up a presentation for her introduction. So I have the honor to introduce our first panelist, Jeannie Holstein, which I had the pleasure to work together with a couple of years ago in organizing the Strategy as Practice Community Day at EGOS. Jeannie now is an assistant professor in strategy and public sector management at Nottingham Business School. In addition to
sorry, can I just correct you there? It's Nottingham University Business School. The other one's the Nottingham Business School.
At Nottingham University Business School. She's not only an experienced SAP scholar, but also has extensive experience in the private sector, in industry, but also in higher education management. So her context for studying strategy is higher education, pluralistic context in higher education, with a particular focus on narrative and discourse. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So can you see the screen okay? Can you see my presentation okay?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just get myself set up. Sorry, I was going to do some timing. So thank you very much for that great introduction, Max. That's lovely, and I'm delighted to join this PDW. I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure about differences. I think let's maybe focus on differences and probably also what unites us, I think. So so I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is based on a theory paper that's currently in review. So it's embryonic, I would say, rather than the finished piece, but it seemed like a timely thing to use. So if I can just move it on a little bit. There we are. So, so I think I'd start with really where we are. So in recent years, there's been a high degree of progress in our understanding of the practices of strategy, not least as a situated, multi-level, multi-active discursive activity. We know that language is especially important for strategy making and how strategy is accomplished through talk and text, and it creates a sense of direction, especially in different uses of the past. We have work that shows who does strategy, senior strategists, middle managers, or strategy consultants, and who gets to participate and how they might participate. We also know with what they participate. So we know the doing of strategy through material and discursive tools. And similarly, we know that socio-material practices such as turn-taking in strategy meetings shape strategy, as can material artifacts such as PowerPoint, including visual mechanisms. So that's also been useful to our understanding of strategy. So taken together, this amounts to significant progress in understanding the discursive, social, and material practices of strategy in competition, in organizing and organization. I think, though, there's still nonetheless a tendency to focus on strategy as simply something that people do with things, not exclusively, but there is a tendency, and to see settled strategy in place of competition for meaning. Again, not exclusively, but a tendency. And that's within what we might otherwise consider a cacophony of multiple voices and arguments and ideological stances. So this is potentially problematic, I think, because strategy really matters in organizing, because it's a performative endeavor. What strategy does, it does not simply describe a reality about an organization's competitive position or sense of direction, nor does it simply comprise a set of practices in that organizing. It constitutes them. It's not something a priori out there, but it's constituted by practices. So we're aware of some of the performative effects of strategy, for instance, from scholars. So strategy narrative at a micro level through particular narrative strategies, and also perhaps at a meso level through a focus on the processes of conversation in situ and the stabilization of those processes through text. But I think, and this is, I guess, my positioning, I think that the continual constitution, deconstitution and reconstitution of strategy, its ongoing material agency, you might say, despite a few notable exceptions and probably coming more from the CCO perspective, are nonetheless under-theorized. And I think this is where the potential of the link between SAP and CCO is something we have to perhaps explore a little bit more. And of course, coming from a narrative perspective, I'm going to do that from language. And I think the basic purpose of doing this, apart from it's great to look at theory, but it's to look at the significant, or at least acknowledge the significant role of the situatedness of strategy practice as a fundamentally dialogical, and by that I mean an encounter between active and active human beings in this increasing competition in organizing, but also the increasing multimodality of organization. So I think that's where I'm coming from, and that's where I think we go back to text, but we do it in a slightly different way. Just moving on, if I can. Okay, so I want to, and again, I would, as Max knows me, he knows that I'm, and Milena know that I'm interested in this strange Russian literary theorist called Mikhail Bakhtin. And I think Bakhtin helps us. I think he's been slightly misused, certainly in certain areas. I think I would certainly like to use his theorizing more extensively than has been in the past. So, and Bakhtin offers us something different. He offers us an ontology of language, I think, and it comes from the premise that nothing's stable. And social life is founded in dialogue, where society or social life is continually coming into being. And from Bakhtin, we take this broad understanding of dialogue, a kind of event of being. So the utterance, it opens us up in relation to other utterances and others. And they're linked in a kind of chain, and a relational chain of utterances. So the world comes into being through these utterances that are instantiated in everything, not just words or text. And that's part of a more complex chain of social interaction. So it's dialogue or dialogicality as an event of being. And so this is then the living embodiment of relations between ourselves and others in dialogue, located in this matrix of social relations and instantiated in a single utterance and linked to all other utterances. So in this sense, this is where I think Bakhtin's really fascinating, is that the social life in this dialogicality is what he calls unfinalizable. So it remains dynamic. And I think this is what I think we need within our thinking about strategy and its performativity. So here, in this moment, there's a potential to notice how we might frame our world differently, and that any meaning is possible in that moment. And this is where we get led down a kind of cul-de-sac, because this potential is fleeting. And because in our meaning making, we search for context, and what dominates this is things that stabilize meaning. So what he calls centripetal forces, as opposed to central fugal forces that destabilize meaning. So we tend to instinctively or naturally draw on cultural norms that are present in every moment of our existence, and that constrain us in genres and notions of time and space. And I think this is where he argues that the novel, he's a literary theorist, is where we might notice these constraints. And I think basically one of the things that, if I just again move on, I'm struggling to move it on. And hey ho, here we have an event of being that I think in my lifetime, probably outside the financial crash and the fall of the Berlin Wall, has been an occasion, our moment of being, where we have noticed flux rather than stability. And we've noticed perhaps the potential to frame our world differently. And it's a moment where meaning is uniquely possible. So I think this is what Bakhtin gives us. He gives us this sort of, if you like, this focus on flux and flow and performance, or performativity, I should say, at this moment. And it's interesting enough that he was writing at a time of great upheaval. He completed his studies in 1918. And he's writing after the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and also a global pandemic, the flu pandemic. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so Bakhtin gives us some of this stuff, and he gives us this idea of becoming, and he asks us to notice the presence of others, many different voices, and he can show how, or ask us to consider how the world is being fixed rather than in flux. So one of the, I'm just conscious a little bit of time. I just want to make sure, sorry, yeah, so I've just run over a little bit. So I think what I would say about Bakhtin then is he saw Carnival as the moment of maximum dialogicality. And I don't really want to finish on Carnival. I want to finish here with COVID. And I think I'm not saying COVID is a carnival, but I think it is one of those moments in our lifetime where we can observe the world being formed in a way that we haven't previously. And I think we can take some of the lessons, some of the insights, some of the ways of thinking that disruption has given it, the sort of carnivalistic upheaval of the world has given us, to revise how we might understand strategy. What I would like to say in conclusion is about Bakhtin. So what does Bakhtin's theorizing help us with? It helps us with examining in more detail the multiplicity, the full diversity of voice, for example, with and without organization or polyphony. And I think that will help us to better understand the performativity of strategy. I think it also helps us try and conceptualize how agreement in strategy might be achieved or not achieved, that is constitutive of action. And I think it adds to our understanding of how more or less widely shared representations of organizations' strategies are developed through communicative practices, especially in, as I said earlier, the increasing multimodality of organizing and organization. And I think really what Bakhtin does for us, it explains how order, disorder, disruption, tension, and disharmony are nonetheless ever present. I think a lesson that we've all learned from COVID-19, and how shared representations, are thereby challenged. So thank you. And I think that's me done. Okay, is that helpful?
Thank you very much, Jeannie. All right, Tim. Yeah, right. You're already turned on your video. And Jeannie, could you please turn it off? Yeah. Thank you very much. All right. So I briefly introduce you, Tim, to the audience. So Tim Kuhn is a professor of communication at the College of Media, Communication and Information at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And his research interests include strategy, authority, practice, communication, and communicative relationality. And today he will talk about authoring strategy, the communicative constitution of strategizing at a growing airline. So we have a case now to look at. And yeah, please, Tim, feel free to start now. And correct me if I said something wrong.
That's terrific. Thank you. And as usual, the title has changed a little bit from the one that was submitted. Irony of Reclaiming the Past, Performativity and Authority in Strategic Change. And this one is, of the papers on the panel, this is an empirical paper, although I think it aligns nicely with what Jeannie was just talking about in terms of performativity, the notion of cacophony, and struggles over meaning. And this is a study of what happened in a growing airline that I studied for about 2 years. So this is a study of strategic organizational change. And in strategic organizational change, managers deploy a range of resources to generate and guide organizational change. And principal among those resources are discourses like statements, slogans, mantra. And often we academics think of these slogans and statements as sort of empty managerial rhetoric, but they're representations of multi-pronged programs that aim to change firms through redirecting employee action, fostering identification, and the like. And, you know, we see that with books that offer best change management programs. Strategic managers intend these slogans, these discourses more generally, to be performative. These discourses don't merely, and they're not merely intended to describe an existing reality. They're meant to bring into existence a new state of affairs through the repeated utterance of these slogans. And performativity theorizing, which Jeannie mentioned just a little bit ago, has burgeoned in organization studies in ways that have sought to describe how this performativity works, and acknowledging that there are more variations, more veins to be mined in terms of performativity theory than I can get into here. One of the things that I want to at least acknowledge is that there's a recognition that these versions of slogans, statements, etc., are intended to bring into existence some version of theorizing. And that theory can be about the firm as well. So that's not terribly interesting. A more interesting move is examining the possibility that these discourses encapsulating a change effort, they can inadequately account for the unforeseen challenges encountered in organizing. So one of the things that performativity theorists have turned toward is this idea that performativity is always bound up with, is always stumbling into failures, misfires, undoings, the notion of disorganizing. So this study is all about struggles over meaning that result from complex and temporary configurations of participants. And the participants there, of course, not just human participants, also those discourses. We'll see a little bit in terms of some versions of materiality as well. So one of the things that is of interest to me is to turn to authority as a resource in struggles to bring forth that reality. If we're talking about performativity as something that that brings some reality into being, and the question is how it happens, not whether it happens, one of the key elements there is to understand how it is that authority becomes part of that process. And so authority not merely as power, but as shaping decidability, as organizational decision-making systems are shaped by authority. Authority is often seen as equivalent then to decidability, having or being seen to have the right to the last word in arriving at decisions, trajectory, and organizational trajectories. And that's, of course, the capacity to structure choice-making practices. One of the things that I'm arguing is that a good, useful tool to understand that is what I've called the authoritative text. And that authoritative text is merely an analytical device to investigate how particular interests get inscribed in practice and how efforts to shape decidability proceed. Okay? So the study, sorry, I put that quote up and I did not make that fly in like the others. So ignore that quote on the bottom until we get there. So the study that I engaged in was guided by this question: how does authority become affixed to particular positions during strategic change, and what unintended consequences unfold as practices and authoritative texts write one another? So 2-year study of Metro Airlines, obviously a pseudonym. Metro Airlines allowed me to follow around supervisors to attend high-level, executive-level, what they called customer focus conferences. Metro Airline, and to conduct focus groups, and then to interview people throughout the organization. One of the things that came up was that the Metro experience became a key discourse. And without getting into great detail here, they suggested that the Metro experience was both about what they delivered to their customers, to their passengers. It's something unique about what Metro provided to passengers was on their minds, but also what they delivered to each other. And that was key to their success as a relatively young and growing airline. So Metro Airlines is a medium-sized airline. It was constituted as a major, or termed, excuse me, a major airline in the United States at the time of this study. Okay. So 3 themes that characterize what I call the authoritative text: strategic managers determined decidability. They structured the process of strategic change. They organized around what they called soft skills, the delivery of these high quality customer experiences. And then there was also a great fear that Metro was losing its distinctive characteristics because of its growth. It had experienced great success, and they often then suggested that the people who joined them in the recent years were not as good as the old people, that the old people are what built this company and cared for each other. These old people, the old time workers, are what created the success, and these younger people don't know. What is going on. So we're supposed to be a brand new culture based on those values and stuff like that. Again, it's a magic. It's why we're winning. And down to the bottom, all of a sudden, there's no caring about what's affecting them, the employees, and when they're out there. It breaks you down psychologically, subconsciously. It breaks you down. Something is being lost. So, acknowledging that we have little time to go through all of this, some unintended consequences of the way that they constructed the notion of authority as in the top, but also as produced, that competencies get produced at the local interactional level. First is a pressure on airport supervisors, and that airport supervisors had a great deal of responsibility, had a great deal of accountability, but not much authority. They did not have capacity to do much in the way of hiring or training. And then second, that decidability, especially at the airport level, was disrupted by irregular operations, IROPs. Okay? I'll let people read through that as they like, but the upshot of both of these is that the way that they constructed authority produced some inability, ironically constrained them in producing the very kinds of customer service opportunities, experiences that they sought to produce. And although they suggested that we want the individuals to produce that, the individual employees and the frontline supervisors, the way that Metro constructed authority, ironically, worked at cross purposes with that. So, irony in the model of authority. Their approach to controlling competency reclamation seems logical as a response to growth, that they hearken back to a lost past, but that perceived control over performance and performativity, that producing the Metro experience and therefore producing that which happens in those frontline service engagements, also was accompanied by this scapegoating. And that scapegoating would allow executives to deny being the source of any kinds of problems, at the same time retaining decidability, and that those executives then could render customer service as simple. But the complexities are what made the supervisors' work difficult. And those irregular operations, so it shows that customer service experience is not merely about what a human provides, and this is perhaps going in greater detail than in terms of the data I was able to provide here, but that the material is sort of outside the experience idea. But the material is very much part of this. And one of the examples in the paper, and I'm willing to share the paper with anybody who'd like to see, one of the things that they encountered was a new airplane that they brought on that required a great deal of organizing around the material, and that threatened their very version of authority. So I am over my time, but I wanted to at least provide some version of how we might think about authority and disorder in the doing of strategizing, acknowledging that our versions of performativity then often encounter ironic consequences. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Tim. So after having heard some insights on theoretical ideas on the nexus between strategy and communication, we had now the empirical insights, and we switch now to like a block of topics that drive also strategy and CCO research at the moment, namely the topic of materiality. And Nicolas Bochaki will be the first panelist of this block, somehow addressing this topic with his talk titled, "Does it matter how to study strategizing by observing the materiality of communication?" And just to briefly introduce you, Nicolas Bochaki, he is Associate Professor of Organizational Communication at the Department of Human Sciences, Arts and Communication at the Université TÉLUC in Montreal. And his research interests include topics of strategizing and CCO, so the communicative constitution of organizations, ethnomethodology and conversation analysis, so that is rather the empirical approach, materiality and community-based organizations. So thanks for joining us today, and the stage is yours now.
Thank you, Milena, for this introduction. So in the interest of time, I'll switch directly to the next slide. Where is it? Yeah. I'm not able to switch slides. Okay, so my presentation is mostly based on this article that you see at the bottom right of your screen, which came out last year in Strategic Organization, and that I wrote along with Viviane Sergi, François Corren, and Consuelo Vasquez. So all the references, and if you need more information, it's in there. And our interest in that paper was how things become strategic, because whilst the ACP community has embraced communication, and in particular has been looking at how people interact and talk during strategic planning exercises, including papers by Kwon and Samha Fredericks from Nottingham, actually, and who have looked at that from an ethnomethodological and conversational analytical perspective. So there has been some work on how strategic plans are produced, are written, are circulated, and so forth. And so there has been a good acknowledgement of communication. However, there has been a sort of presumption, in our opinion, or a sort of a assumption that whatever takes place during those meetings is strategic. So whatever people are talking about during strategic meetings is strategic to begin with. Or alternatively, people have considered that strategy or determining what is strategic is based on negotiating interests of people's interests. So I have, or my department or my service has some interests, and yours has some other interests, and then let's try to negotiate what will be prioritized, or what will be more strategic than something else. And so this question has been, we're not the first to raise that. And so Jean-Pascal Dogon, Laure Cabantou, and others have raised that in a 2018 paper. And so they have suggested, for instance, that issues become strategic by being coupled through practice with other issues. And so when I take, let's say, when I am able to attach, let's say, my priority to some other already strategic priority, then my priority becomes strategic as well. But we would like to suggest, I would like to discuss with you here another way of doing that, of figuring out how things become strategic. And it is by recognizing something that has yet to be fully understood, and it's the materiality of communication and how issues become strategic as they materialize in communication. So, an important problem, in my opinion, is that communication is often reduced to language. And so it's talk, it's people talking together, interacting together. We may recognize perhaps that they use documents and so forth, but it remains a verbal and linguistic issue for the most part. However, we must recognize that communication is also material, at least in three senses. So the first one is what we refer to usually when we use the term performativity, meaning that it matters. it does make a material difference in each situation. It actually changes behaviors. It actually changes the ordering of I don't know, furniture in a room, or the ordering of bodies in that room. Also, it is material in the sense, in the more conventional sense, that it may be written, drawn, or inscribed in a document, a software, an artwork, that give to those ideas some durability. So it becomes we can invoke or convoke that document a few years later, and so forth. However, we must also recognize that even face-to-face communication, so even oral communication, rests on a specific way of speaking. So for instance, you can tell that I have an accent. I'm not a native speaker of English. I have chosen a specific set of words to say whatever I'm trying to convey. And so those things matter as well, and they are material as well. And they are important because the communication then is, because it is material, can offer substance to ideas, principles, and other seemingly abstract figures. And this is important because it provides them with autonomy. So from the moment I have written down something, or from the moment the air from my lungs leaves my mouth, it gains autonomy, and I have no more control on what I have said. Okay, so I'm losing control over that, and my words may even contradict me. But it also makes them, the materiality of communication also makes it available for collective scrutiny. So you can discuss my ideas because I have used those words specifically. And also it's interesting for researchers because it is because of the materiality of communication that we can go back and see what people have said because of recordings, because of documents, or if we are present in the scene, that we can hear how people talk and what words they use and how they express themselves. And this is especially important, or there's an added layer of importance, because it means that existence, or any idea, principle, routine, whatever you want to call it, exists more or less, because it can be materialized in more or less ways. So my words become a recording, then they can become let's say a report on this PDW, then they can become a YouTube video, perhaps, if you put that online, and so forth. And so they can gain more and more materiality and more importance as they gain more and more forms of existence, or materializations, so to speak. And so this is important because then it means that to understand how something becomes strategic, and this is what we suggest in the paper that I just mentioned, is that we can follow how an idea moves from an initial materialization. So someone will use specific words to introduce that idea in the first place. So this is what we call present defying. So it's the first appearance of that idea. And then we can follow whether other people or other inscriptions or other documents or other materializations take place. And so whether they are, that idea is substantiated through additional materialization. Okay, so, and which one exactly, and what forms those additional materializations take. And depending on those materializations, we will be able or not to attribute that concern, that problem, that idea to the organization, or to an organization, maybe not ours, maybe some other organization. So it matters, like the kind of materialization, what form exactly it takes, will determine to some extent whether we can grasp it, capture it, attribute it to someone else, make it our own, and so forth. And then finally, the last phase that we identify in the paper is crystallizing, is whether that materialization can be converted into a coherent program of action. It's something that we can appropriate in the more psychological sense of figuring out how we are supposed to act on that basis and get somewhere with that, okay? And so this is important, because if we are able to move through those different phases, then we are able to determine that this idea or that concern is strategic indeed. And so I'm already over my time, but just for a quick example, we have here a counterexample from the article, where Damien is concerned that a community-based organization working with tenants is too rough on those who have, that's the part that I have highlighted in green here, on those landlords who have small buildings, 4, 5, 6 unit or a 2 unit. And so he materializes his concern about what strategy or what intervention methods we use with those smaller landlords by suggesting by using that notion of having small buildings. Okay, so these are the good guys and we should not go against them or go for them. But then, because he chooses that particular way of conveying this idea, the others, and that's what's highlighted in pink at line 19, line 22, are able to say, well, there are not so many small buildings in this district, actually. It's many big buildings and so forth. And eventually, this idea is dropped out. It's left out of the table because it turns out that there aren't so many small buildings. But the idea being that if he had chosen a different form of materialization, then maybe people would have been able to appropriate that idea and turn it into a plan of action for themselves, because it would have resonated with the other materialities that are at play in that situation. And so that's it, and I'm sorry for being over my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nico, for your presentation. So it's time for our final presentation, which is supposed to be kind of a counterpart to yours. So it's on materiality, on the nexus of materiality, communication, and strategy as well. And in the program, you can see this is supposed to be a double or a team presentation by Virpi Sorsa and Nada Enrisat. But today, the paper or the project will be presented by Virpi. I am here, other slides. Virpi is an assistant professor at Hanken School of Economics in Helsinki, and she, at least in the past, mainly studied strategy work in city organizations. And there, she also had a communicative focus, so to say, focusing on inclusive and discursive aspects of strategizing. And with this brief introduction, I hand over to our final presenter.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And so in line with the PDW's interest in integrating the communication perspective into strategy as practice communities, research interest, and asking what and how do human and non-human actors communicate throughout strategy making processes, our presentation continues to explore the constitutive entanglement of the social and material in everyday organizational life. And our interest is specifically in understanding how strategizing activities are accomplished with materials. And at times, those processes can be deeply affecting experiences for participants. So in this presentation and the paper that this presentation is based on, we focus on musical interventions as an embodied form of communication that was used to implement, communicate, and make sense of a large-scale strategic change. And our work is very much in progress, and we are in the process of exploring the empirical material at the moment. And here we present our findings from a longitudinal research on strategic change in a Finnish healthcare organization to highlight how CCO perspective has informed our understanding of musical interventions as an embodied and material constitution of a new strategy. There are some conceptual linkages that we would like to highlight. So, as already mentioned, strategy as practice research has a long history of documenting how people do strategy in text and discourse, and thereby providing the base for communicative understanding of strategizing. But there is more to communication than text, as there is also more to practice than discursive practices. On the other hand, scholars of communicative constitution of organization draw attention to how organizational activities are generated, renewed, and reproduced through interaction and communication, and provide base to explore strategy, how strategy is brought into being through communicative acts. And we see that it's specifically the CCO perspective that offers the base to explore how strategy is material practice and how it's through these material activities, we constitute our strategizing communication. And in this research project, we build on our prior research on how music can facilitate coordination and collective experiences, and focus on how music as effective communication complements our knowledge about material practices in strategy work and the communicative constitution of organizations. The longitudinal case study of the large-scale strategic change project was documented in the private healthcare sector. The company was struggling with implementing new legislative norms due to fast turnover of employees, as well as the competition in the private healthcare market was tightening when the new strategy was introduced. The strategic change included goals such as to increase customer orientation, to restructure the departments into smaller business units, and to provide more personal home-like services for the customers. These goals received mixed reactions among staff, including resistance, and thus the company CEO invited a consultation company to facilitate work counseling during the strategic change process. And the typical exercise used by the consultation company was a band practice in which employees form a band and tries out different roles through playing different instruments or singing. The work counseling consisted also more traditional work counseling, such as one-on-one meetings or group conversations. The data was collected between 2013 and 2017, and here you see a data overview of different data sources and how those data sources were used in the analysis. To summarize the data includes participant observations, interviews, online questionnaires, and documents, such as the consultant firm's PowerPoint presentations and company reports. And this data was analyzed through looking at the research question: how does engaging in musical practices open up or close down possibilities for change? Here I present the findings from the current empirical analysis. So when analyzing the data, we discovered 3 dynamics. And the 3 dynamics are here. We found that the music used in the work counseling during the strategic change process was supporting conversation, so enabling communication to address issues at strategy work. We found also that music was suppressing, shutting down communication. So there was no possibility to voice critique towards the strategic changes. And then we found music as being parallel, neither helping nor hurting communication. So it was this just too long or taking too much time during the work counseling, and it was seen as being on top of everything else and having no connection to strategic change. And here are a few examples from our data. So there were altogether 13 different units and altogether about 200 employees whose descriptions we have analyzed. And here are some examples from the participants describing how music was affecting their experiences during the strategic change process. So playing music sets the atmosphere free and makes it more relaxed. That way you get everybody's opinion and you can talk about the real important issues. In the second example, the participant describes how they dare to express their own opinions openly. Here there are two examples from music as suppressing and shutting down communication. So the participant in the unit rocking chair is describing that you're wasting time from important issues and those that the participant sees essential. And those issues that the participant sees as essential in strategic change is left to background and undiscussed. In the second example, the participant describes that and asks, why do you have to participate in playing music if you actually find the experience as distressing? The third example is about music as neither helping or hurting. So the participant says that it was nice, but I can't say how it would have benefited the strategic change process. To conclude, so we have started to explore how music can be seen as a material communicative practice. As our findings have shown, for some workers, the use of music opens up new possibilities of relating in strategic change processes, making possible and opening up new forms of communicating, comprehending, and expressing. For others, however, it implies a closing down and muting, foreclosing further problematization and contestation. As such, music might be seen through its critical ambiguity as both technology of organization and transformative force, which offers ways to rethink traditional organizational settings, both in relation to control and to critique. From a critical perspective, the musical interventions represent an instrument of managerial control to regulate the new model worker as flexible, agile, and resilient. However, as the positive experiences of some of the workers suggest, music can also be a way to reframe and expand what can be perceived, opening up new possibilities of relating that might not have shown in organizational life prior to the intervention, and reflecting a reconfiguration of existing practices. So our aim has been to link practice theory and socio-material practices of music on one hand, and on the other, CCO theory and its openness to non-human actants and affective forms of communicating. However, our challenge is to document our findings, especially the observations. We are struggling how to catch them and to translate them in written form so that it can be communicated to others, especially the ways of how the music is embodied in the participants' communication. And I stop here. Thank you very much for the opportunities to present our research.
Thank you very much, Virpi. I would suggest that we, as we would have done at the non-virtual Academy of Management, would start with a quick round of impressions that each of you got of these 4 panel presentations, and maybe you already identified some overlaps or connecting points or some stark differences between the SAP and CCO perspective.
One of the things that struck me was that each of us, in one way or another, often in different ways, was wrestling with questions of materiality, materialization. That especially as Nico was saying, that so frequently communication and then the discourses that are bound up in strategizing are rendered as merely symbolic or ideational, and that so much of this work that we're engaged in here today is interested in A, rejecting that simple characterization, and then B, engaging with the materiality, and C, transcending that simple distinction between discourse and material. And so I appreciated that across the papers. I think I did the worst job of all of trying to explain where I'm coming down there. But I think that was something that really, that was striking to me. But then also, what I heard across the papers is people not just interested in engaging with some abstract notion of materiality, but then to see how it is that discourse material or socio-material domain gets bound up in strategizing, but that we can't leave that as simple and straightforward, that it's always, in Virpi's idea, that it's always critically ambiguous, that there's always a degree of excess, of potentiality, of ambiguity that we need to be able to trace analytically in our work. So I appreciated that across all the papers.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think what was interesting for me was this. I think what stood out was Nicholas's paper, and how there was actually some commonality between what I was saying or theorizing from a Bakhtinian perspective. I think I would say it's kind of the Christine Keeler defense. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think you were talking about specific materializations, if I've got that correctly. And one of the misuses of Bakhtin is around intertextuality, because David took it as an intertextual and talked about the intertexts, and I think Bakhtin wanted that to be more considered in a more intersubjective or intersubjectivity way. So I could see how the theorization that I was trying to bring together between strategies of practice and CCO was actually coming through in your work, and it's an excellent paper. So that was interesting. And I think I'm just being a little bit controversial, but I think that Virpi's paper was something, it was really, you talked about supporting, suppressing and parallel, and I think that's the heteroglossic exchange. I think those are the centralizing or centripetal or centrifugal forces that are going on. And I think the business of music, what a brilliant empirical site, and what an amazing endeavor, really. You can see everything that's wrong with it and everything that's right with it. I think that's a sort of form of carnival, actually, where things are being disruptive. So having introduced Bakhtin from the left field and felt a little bit out on a limb, I can see how what we're all trying to get at is this materialization can be considered if we still think of language as an ontology. I take all the points about language, not the oral, the differences in oral, and I think the musical expression is where the ontology of language stretches a bit. But you might find something there with cacophony and polyphony, actually, because isn't polyphony multi-voiced? And I'm conscious of speaking Bakhtinian to somebody, to that part of the world, if you like. But anyway, those are my sort of left of field thoughts. originally, that we've actually got more in common than it first appeared.
Yeah, I actually would have a kind of a follow-up question for you, because I was really listening carefully what you were saying about the COVID and the carnivalistic era that we are now experiencing. So my further question for you would be that, could you please elaborate a bit further what you mean by the COVID's carnivalistic COVID as a carnivalistic era at the moment?
Yes, so basically what there's sort of two perspectives on carnival. One is a kind of show thing, as a pageant, and it's something that can be contained, actually, so it's a letting off steam, and certainly lots of literary theorists think of it like that, and Terry Eagleton is one of them, so it comes from that arena. Bakhtin saw carnival in a much more essential sense, that it was our opportunity to renew, to rebirth, to recreate. And to do that, we had to disrupt, and we had to see what the flux was and where it was settling. And so he uses Rabelais, that's his literary source for this. But one of the things that strikes me about the carnival of the moment isn't what is normally considered carnival or parody or sort of verbal composition. It's more about the bodily, the moment of death and rebirth that we're experiencing. And I think that's more carnivalistic than's been previously considered. So what's associated with Bakhtin's carnival is this thing called grotesque realism. And my God, we're living grotesque realism, are we not? You know, the scenes particularly from Italy, this is horrendous. So it's carnival in that sort of dark sense, which Bakhtin, he was very sort of, what's the word? I would say that he wanted it to be true, that you could get this renewal and this rebirth. But yes, so it's through the grotesque realism. I think that's where I see it as carnivalistic or carnival.
Yeah,
does that make sense? So the upskittling, so to use a sort of English word, so the upturning of things, and at the same time this realization of the body and death and birth, which was actually in carnival in Rabelais.
Thanks.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I was actually then also kind of, now when you were talking, thinking about the conversation I had with one of my colleagues, and she said that while she's been teaching online the whole spring, there is something there's something they're missing, and she's been trying to figure out what it is, because many of the practices online are it's only online, so only the kind of the medium has changed, not much the practices or the contents and so on. So she's been trying to figure out what is it that is missing, that she kind of feels but can't see in those things that she do. And she said that maybe it's the scent of a human. And now when you were talking about the crude realism, I think that is also what we are kind of experiencing, that when everything is kind of happening through different kinds of mediums now, so we are experiencing something that is missing, and it comes to very crude realistic things.
And so for strategy, then we have this sort of content. We have this, and actually it's hugely disruptive at the moment. And I think that's, so one way of looking at that is to say that the strategists can't see into the future. The future is actually, this uncertain future that we normally push to one side is right in front of us, if you like. But I think it's a discontent in strategy, because it's disrupting even that. even the practices of strategy, how we go about it, I think. So, but that's not the paper, but it's, I just couldn't resist the COVID slide in this presentation, because it just, you know, I think we can't ignore it and what it's doing to us. And back to, I mean, so the other side of it is that it will settle, you know, that the centralizing forces will, you know, and we can see that in the UK, what's happening. They're desperately trying to reframe this disruption. But yeah, so. Yeah, I'd love go on, sorry.
Can I try to make a few connections between some of the things that we have been saying?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think that you know, polyphony is very important in CCO, of course. So, and I think a lot of our work, and I recognize that in what you did, Virpi, in what you presented, is precisely to learn to listen to different kinds of voices. And so for SAP already, it was a big step to just listen to other people than top managers, to listen maybe to middle managers. And I think the work that us around this, well, virtual table are doing is to try to listen to yet other voices, and you know, to the voice of music and objects and other things that we still don't quite have the tools. As you know, it was, I think, one of your concluding remarks, Virpi, we don't have the tools to actually listen to those things that do express themselves, even when we think that only top managers are speaking, you know, so we need to be attuned to those voices. And then concerning the carnival, I'm wondering if we can't relate that to Tim's notion of authoritative text, yes, in the sense that the carnival is where you do not have an authoritative text anymore to sort of decide for you which voices matter, which voices don't matter. And so all of a sudden, you know, you have what you perceive as cacophony, because you do not have that guideline on whose voice matters, what really counts and what really doesn't really count. And so I see more connections. I agree that I think SAP and CCO were you know, twin brothers separated at the nursery by mistake or something like that.
Yeah, great comment. I mean, I think the issue is that we are stuck to words when we are writing articles. So it's very difficult to express or to use data that is not in words or in language as we understand written language. So of course there are more and more papers coming out using pictures and videos and so on. So I think there it's increasing the different ways of expressing also other types of material. But I think overall, I think I'm still very much struggling how to write an article without using the words in illustrating the empirical examples or empirical phenomena.
Yeah, I think I agree. Sorry, I just should have said that I had written down authoritative text. So that was the thing. That was the other. I saw that as this kind of centralizing force as well. So sorry for not including you there, Tim. So in answer to Virpi's piece, we should all perform our research in some form. Maybe, I don't know. I know that we're working with some visual materials at the moment. We're working with video. TV, actually a TV series. So that's a paper that I'll just do a little advert. We're presenting in the SAP track at the Academy. And we are finding the time to play some of that TV. I just think we need to do more of it as organizational scholars. I think we would see more. And the materialization, I think that for me is where it's really important to understand. And I mean, I always conceptualize that in strategy terms as settling, which I don't think is helpful, actually, having had this discussion. I think it's more about materializing. But yeah, so, you know, I've got something really I think, important out of that. It's changing the way I'm seeing it, certainly.
One of the things that I'm sorry to jump in, but across these, one of the things that jumps out to me is this notion of disorder or disorganizing or mess that organizing and strategizing tends to be far more complex and ugly than we give it credit for. And whether that's occasioned by COVID or it's occasioned by a planned organizational change, and whether there is an authoritative text that seeks to create order out of that apparent disorder and is always wrestling with what we as the strategist intend to be the normal or the new normal or the next normal, as we hear with COVID, or with intra-organizational strategizing practices. One of the things that I think both SAP and CCO are continually trying to get their minds around is this notion of order disorder dynamics, something that of course has been of interest to organization studies folks for a long time, but what I hear across these papers today is a real effort to try to understand that constant interplay, dialectic, whatever we might want to call it, as not just characteristic of organizing, but as constitutive of organization, that those tensions are what constructs the organization or constitutes the organization in ways that produce what we take organization to be in the very first place. So I'm sorry to jump in again, but yeah, that was fascinating to me. I took several notes. That's going to be useful for me. Thank you.
I think that's a really good summary, by the way.
I think so too, and I think we should come to an end here so that we do not extend the time too much. Thank you everyone for this great discussion, and I don't know, Max, do you want to add something or ask something more, or should we leave it here? Because
I think that's in fact a good natural point to close this discussion here.
I think it was great to see the overlaps. Although I think we might have missed the differences, somehow we've seen that there are great overlaps, and that is also nice to have it as an end.
That's great, and thank you to you both. Fantastically well organized and well pulled together for this.
Yes, thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining, and also thank you for everyone who has watched this video actually. So I wish you as panelists a great academy, and of course for the listeners in the audience as well, a great virtual experience.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye. Bye.